All right. Hello, everybody. This is Caitlin Albright, Education Coordinator for the Everson Museum, and we have Katie Shulman on for today. So Katie is currently an MFA student at Syracuse University. She is a working artist, and we're going to chat with her a little bit about her experience in the arts and what she's been up to lately. So welcome, Katie.
Hi.
So Katie, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your background and your interest in the arts? How did you get involved? Have you always been making art? What's your story?
Sure. So, actually when I think back onto my childhood, it's really marked by sports. I was a big sports girl. I grew up in the 90s, and I feel like being on a soccer team was like your calling card. So I was really into sports, really actively participated in lots of team sports, and always had the interest in art. Maybe it was more tangential, but then in my early teens, I had the opportunity to learn how to glass blow. And there was something so similar between being on a sports team and sort of how athletic and team oriented glass blowing was. So that sort of like opened up this whole world of creativity and making, and sort of understanding how there are parallels maybe between lots of different interests of mine. And so once I learned how to glass blow, a lot of other sort of creative opportunities and fields opened up to me. And then eventually I decided, at the end of my high school career, I didn't go to an arts high school or anything. And it was actually sort of odd to take the path of going to art school. But I had the opportunity also while I was in high school to do this like alternative learning program that was really based in experiential learning, and something just really clicked, the idea of actually learning through doing. So it really felt like an art program was right for me, and I decided to go, and then got my BFA and wanted to move to New York City and actually stop making art. And it just came back after a couple years of being a regular working person in New York City. And I like felt this urge. I needed to get back into some sort of making. And that eventually led me to decide to switch gears again and get my Master of Fine Arts. And I think what's the most important thing about my story is I waited 8 years after my undergrad. Like, it is literally never too late to think, maybe I want to do something else. I want to pivot. So that's that's my main thing. It's never, ever, ever too late.
No, that's fantastic advice. And so you mentioned that you were kind of away from art for a little while. You took a step back. What were the circumstances that led to you stepping away from it and then eventually finding your way back? Because I think it's really interesting. And a lot of times as artists, we feel almost like a little bit of shame if we take a step back. It's like, well, why are you not making art? I know I've gotten that reaction before in the times I've stepped away from it. And I think it's important to know that you can come back to it at any point in your life. So you can talk a little bit more about that experience.
Yeah, so I grew up in Washington, D.C. So I lived, the first 18 years of my life on the East Coast. And this experiential learning program I did for a semester in high school was in Westchester, which is a little bit outside of New York City. And the whole premise of the program was to learn about New York City by experiencing the city. The program just shut down, but it was called City Term. It was amazing. So I had this seed planted that after I went to undergrad, I needed to move to New York City. It was just, it was the place where I learned how to learn. It was the first place I went to without my parents. I knew I needed to get back there. And when I graduated from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor with that sort of perspective, I knew I was going to be on my own in terms of finances, and I really did not have, it's hard to say, like, if I didn't have the imagination or the confidence or understanding of how to move to an expensive city and support myself with just an art practice.
Mhm.
So the decision was really practical, and I chose sort of location over profession. And the way I sort of squared that decision with myself was saying, okay, if I can't be making art, then at the very least, I will put myself in working positions that I will be either working with teaching artists or working with people who are trying to learn about art on their own. So I found myself working in a lot of nonprofit spaces in um, art schools and art centers, and even a college where I could sort of support the learning of others. So the decision was really practical. I just really couldn't understand how I could be a working artist and support myself.
Mhm.
And then the way it sort of went was I was working with these teaching artists, and the second they learned I had a BFA, they're like, "Well, what's your studio practice like right now? What are you doing?" And I was really struck by. I totally know what you mean. I sometimes feel like we put that upon our
Mhm.
the anxiety of not making. We put that upon ourselves, but then actually. I found that in my sort of extended community, it wasn't a badgering. It was like a, well, what are you doing? Show me what you're doing. You have to be doing something. Like, we want to have this conversation with you too. And I felt really encouraged, and seeing these working artists thrive in New York City, I was like, oh, wow, that was a lack of imagination on my part. This is possible. You could do this. So then, very slowly, as I was still working in these nonprofit spaces, I figure out ways to sort of my background was in printmaking, so I'd start taking printmaking classes and then realize that I could parlay like a class into free studio time at a school. So it just very sort of slowly came back, but the decision was really grounded in desperately wanting to be in New York City. So that's where that decision came from. And right, it took 8 years to sort of get back fully in the swing
Yeah.
of things. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And here I am.
That's fantastic. I think a lot of students that I work with in teen council too, they wonder about all the different ways they can fit art into their lives. Some of them know they want to pursue a career in the arts, and others know that they want to go in a different direction, do something else, maybe have a background in science, go that route, but they really value their experience in the arts. So what do you say to anybody who is maybe looking to always relate to the arts, always be making and doing, even if that's, not their full-time career? How do you manage to work it into your life again?
Right. So, I mean, for me, and it's actually really interesting when you are a person maybe who has a full-time job, but making and staying engaged is really important. I actually found that I became sort of more flexible and creative with the places that I would look and then seek out to make. So when I was sort of desperate to start making again, it took me to the School of Visual Art, where I took a printmaking class. It took me to this amazing community press in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, called Shoestring Studio. All of these places are sort of thinking specifically how to gear their programming towards people who aren't necessarily working artists. So there'll be weekend classes, there'll be evening classes. And the way I started to think of it is like, like on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I have a printmaking evening activity. I mean, it just sort of becomes part of your, uh, it becomes like, I pause to use the word hobby, but I do think that that's not a derogatory word in this sense. If you have a life and a full-time schedule, like, people are obsessed and need to do so many different things, and they make time in their lives to do that. And I've always been really oriented towards, I have the studio practice now, but I really thrive in like workshop and classroom settings. I feel like my process and practice anyways grows and finds strength when I'm learning new things, and I'm specifically around other people learning new things. So for me, workshops, residencies, I learned about the craft schools at this point in my life, like Penland, Haystack, Arrowmont. These were all places that started coming into my consciousness when I knew I had to find different times to make the work. But what's amazing is, it's a very small percentage of people who might be full-time artists. And honestly, like, I'm about to graduate with a professional degree in it, and I'm very aware that my path is not, my job situation is gonna have to be a mix of a lot of different things. So even with a secondary degree in this, my reality is actually very similar to a lot of your teen council members' reality. I might have had 3 extra years to like hone my craft, orient myself in my practice, but the future still, I'm gonna have to do this balancing act. So I would say, one, it's never too late to, even if you need to take a pause, pauses are pauses.
Yeah.
You can always find your way back. And then two, if you need it, you'll figure it out. And like for a long time before I was even an SVA, my poor roommates at the time, like I converted our kitchen table to like a part-time studio, right? Like, and that's another thing too, in this sort of really weird, uncertain time, I'm sort of hearkening back to that like really scrappy, like finding different places in my house to do some work. So that's another thing, like you can even transform your living space in some way to make it so like you always have access to creative work. If you want it, it's always there.
That's a great point. Can you tell us a little bit more about the body of work that you're currently making? And do you feel like these makeshift studio spaces that you incorporate, do you think that influences the type of work that you create in any way?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. So this is a really strange time, right? Because I am due to graduate in May, and everything has been canceled, right? Including I don't have access to my studio anymore. And my studio, I think, Caitlin, that's such an interesting idea. And I think the answer is yes, my work changes based on where I'm working, because my studio at Syracuse is huge. It's very big. I'm so lucky. And my work has responded to the space that I can work in. So some of the images you post on Instagram, the work is large and it fills up space. And I do sort of adjust to the space I'm working in. So without access to that space, a couple of things have had to change: scale, and then also materiality. Like when I'm working at school, I'm making a lot of like armature out of found objects. They sort of build and become these larger shapes. I don't have access to my like armature pieces anymore, and I don't have the space to make anything really large. So I've actually, as a way to sort of work on that, I've definitely scaled down the work in terms of scale, but also in terms of what I'm thinking about. So instead of a work that's usually comprised of 3 different material components, which are bed sheets, I always use bed sheets. So my work is fibers based in general, and the components are bed sheets. I use a lot of elastic bra strapping to make nets to hold things, and then this hard armature that I wrap with the bed sheets to give some sort of structure. So now I don't have access to my bulk bra strapping. I'm not like ordering a lot right now, and I don't have access to my hard armature. So I'm focusing a lot on these bed sheets. And actually what I've started doing is thinking about applying the bed sheets in a way that I'd been applying the bra strapping. So I'm doing a ton of knitting, which I usually do, but with a different material. And I'm focusing on very small interactions, on very small pieces. So there's been this like scaling down on multiple points. And then the other funny thing is I have different spaces in my house where different parts of my process happen. So I was lucky enough, like I'm dyeing stuff out in my garage. Like I've moved my car out of my garage, so I have this tiny little dye shed now. And then, I live in a shared space with my partner and some roommates, so we have an extra room. I have like a knitting chair, but then I have, space where I tear down the bed sheets to make them a continuous sort of strand that I can knit with. So the way I have different spaces almost for different things. So that's a way too that I've like shifted the work. So I'm riffing on sort of these methods and modalities of working that I established and I use to make my work. Oh my gosh. And then I've started like drawing on my iPhone. like out of sort of this desperation and weird, I don't have access to some of the things, and I've never been an iPhone drawer, but I plan what I'm going to do in my notes on my iPhone, which has
You
been
just use the Notes app and you just sketch it all out in there.
finger. That's it. Yeah. And in this like now, so that's, and I've never drawn before. Like, so the interesting thing about this time is, you know, desperate times call for desperate measures, and desperate measures sort of show you like new aspects of your process you can potentially find. So that's been this whole new thing that weirdly I'm sort of jazzed about. Like, it's this really interesting way to sort of plan what I'm doing, then execute it, and then come back to it to see, like, was I on the right track? You know, how did everything sort of unfold? So a lot has
Wow.
weirdly changed. Yeah.
Fascinating. So I guess this pandemic has really shifted not only what you're able to make, but your way of thinking about your art and how you approach it too. But it's also really enlightening to hear all of that, because it's a testament to how committed you are to it. And that despite all these different times in your life where you've been kind of either pulled away or redirected from art, you've still managed to find your way back. Even in the midst of all of this, you're making time and space for yourself to come back and create. So I think that's inspiring for anybody who feels apprehensive about how they're going to work it into their lives.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think like we know what we need, right?
Yeah.
Like, we all know what we need. And I think the most important thing that I could recommend to anyone is just to listen to what you need. You know, I needed to move to New York City, so I made that decision. And then I knew I needed to start working again. I got itchy, so I listened. And I think, you know, you can be kind and listen to that voice and trust it. And you know, back to sort of your comment about the pause, the pausing, there are days where I don't want to look at any of this stuff, right? There are days where I just like want to go on a walk, or, you know, try to cook something different. And I think that is okay too,
Yeah.
especially during this time. I mean, um, it's so strange. Everyone's life is changing. And I think the only thing we can do is like listen to our gut and trust that our gut knows what we need. So yeah, I just try to listen and be patient and kind. But also, truly, I'm not a, you know, my partner is really different from me. He's like looking at this time. I'm a schedule person.
Mhm.
And that's another reason how I get things done is like I wake up every day. That's like, what day is it? And I try really hard to adhere to a schedule, and I have goals about things that I want to accomplish. So if you are a person like me, you know, list making is my best friend. And so while I try to be flexible, I also understand I need a schedule and I need to understand where I'm going. So that's been another thing that has helped me so much. Like, I have goals, and I have sort of a schedule. I think about sort of how the day progresses. So that's been really helpful to me too during this wacky time.
That's fantastic. I think that's advice that everybody can really relate to. Also, just anything to keep ourselves on task and maintain a sense of normalcy throughout this is pretty crucial right now. But I just want to say thank you so much for sharing all of your words of wisdom with us. I think this is super valuable information that I know is going to really help a lot of people and strike a chord with so many people who are kind of trying to navigate this time that we're in right now. And everything you shared was just perfect. So thank
Oh,
you for taking
great.
the time
Yeah,
to talk to us today. It was
of
great to
course.
see you as always, and hope to see you again in real life soon.
Yeah, right. Take care, Caitlin, and everyone else out there. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.